welcome back to this week's ARTFX Tutorial Tuesday, in which I teach you how to make electronic music with Ableton Live. I highly recommend watching this video in 1080p, so you got a clear view of what I'm doing. Last week I created a cool saw-based intro sound, and today we're going to add another sound to the intro to spice things up. We're going to create a saw wave chord melody with Rob Papen's Albino tree, add some filter sweeps to this chord melody, and we're gonna process it even further with other effects. So let's get started. Here we are back with my project for this tutorial series. So the intro has a bit more drive to it now with the saw bass sound in there, but it lacks some power. So today I'm going to add a fancy chord melody which isn't that hard to make. I prepared a blank MIDI track and loaded Albino tree. On there, as you can see, I'll put a link to the product page in the description box below. For this tutorial I also prepared a MIDI clip with the actual notes I'm going to use. The melody uses major and minor chords, all within the A minor scale. For more information about chords and scales, please watch my other video tutorial called All About Chords, Scales and Melody. First I go to my file browser on the left and browse to the folder I saved the MIDI file in. So let's drag this MIDI file to the MIDI track I prepared and let's click No on the dialog box that comes up, since the tempo of this clip is the same as the project's tempo. Also notice I made the MIDI track in the synths group, the same group as the saw bass from last week. Now let's hear how it sounds right off the bat. Okay, it sounds very atmospheric at the moment, and that's not what we're looking for. So let's fire up Albino tree. The first thing I always do is create a blank preset. Now this is a bit tricky in Albino tree if you don't know where to look for it. Right here you have the preset browser. First I switch to the preset bank Diverse Sounds, and then in the drop down menu below I choose the preset Z Initial Preset. Now I have a blank preset to start with. Okay, onto the oscillator section. Oscillator 1 is already set to the analog mode, which is what I'm going to use today. First, let's play the sound to hear what I've got so far. Now, oscillator 1 is going to provide the main sound for this synth, so I make sure that it's set to a saw waveform. Now, for the symmetry, I push it all the way up to the square shape. This gives it a nice bottom end to it compared to when I take the symmetry all the way down. The difference is pretty big, and depending on the sound you're going for, you can change this setting to make the chord seem a bit lighter in terms of sound. Now, for oscillator 2, I'm also gonna set the mode to analog and turn it on. Then set the waveform to 12 o'clock. This means that since we have a saw wave on the far left side and a square wave on the far right side, our waveform for oscillator 2 will be a mix between the saw and the square wave. Again, I push the symmetry all the way up. I also took the volume of the second oscillator down a little. Now, I raised the pitch of oscillator 2 by a full octave to create a bit more upper harmonics in the chords. Now, to give this chord a bit more warmer sound, I'm raising the sub-oscillator on oscillator 2, which introduces a bit more lower harmonics. And Then finally I press this sync button to make sure the frequency of the sub-oscillator is in time with oscillator 2 itself. Finally, I like to spread the high frequency oscillator a bit. This introduces modulation called detuning. Now, be careful with the spread knob, since you can lose a lot of punch if set too high. Under the filter section. For this patch, we only need filter 1, which is already set to the cream filter mode, and I'm going to leave it like that. The only thing I use Albino's filter for in this sound is for its saturation options. So let's add a bit of saturation to make the sound a bit warmer. You can browse through the 4 available saturation types to see which one sounds best. I like the third one a lot. It seems to really beef up the low end. Under the envelope section. Here I only raise the release amp envelope a bit to bring out the tail of our chords and to let them fade out a bit more. Notice you can also click the envelope box below the setting to change the curve of the envelope. Time for some effects. In the effects section, let's activate FX1 and make sure it's set to a chorus. First I take the dry wet down, so the chorus effect is not so clearly audible, but fairly subtle. Also let's bring the rate down a bit. The rate controls the speed of the chorus modulation. For FX2, I choose a reverb and then enable it. First I take down the dry wet again to make the reverb a lot more subtle. If you use too much reverb, your sound will drown in the reverb signal, and this makes it hard to mix with the rest of the track. For FX3, I choose a compressor. Now, with this, I'm going to bring the reverb tail more up front. First I lower the threshold a bit further, and then I bring up the ratio a bit so we can start hearing the compressor take action when our sound plays. Now, when I raise the ratio, you can hear that the attack of our chords becomes very loud. This is because the compressor is set to a medium attack. It takes a little while when our sound hits before the compressor starts to react. So if I turn the attack all the way down, the compressor reacts almost instantly, and thus you won't hear the loud attack anymore. So now let's bring the release up. This sets the time the compressor takes to drop back to 0 when a chord's hit. Now, when I move the ratio up even more, you can really start to hear the reverb tail come more up front. So, for the final effect slot, I choose a lo-fi. This is sort of a bit crusher effect, which I only use to add some grit to the high end of the chords like this. See, that sounds pretty solid already. Let's listen to this in context with the rest of the track. Okay, so I can drop the volume on the chords a little since they became a little too loud. So it's time to add some more effects now. First, I add an EQ8 to the chords and then high pass them at about 350 Hz with EQ 0.1. Then I take EQ 0.2 and give it a little wide cut around the mid-range area. This is to get rid of some of the mid-frequencies in the chords which seem to be overpowering the high end a bit. Now, with EQ 0.3, I boost some of the high frequencies a little to make sure the chords sound fresh and can pierce through our mix easier. Because of all this subtractive EQing going on, we lose some volume. So let's raise the track volume a bit. And actually let's lower EQ 0.1's frequency a little to let some of those low frequencies back in, just a tiny bit to maintain that warm sound. Now I increase the loop area and I'm going to apply some filter sweeps to this chords by using autofilter. First I drag 2 instances of autofilter to the chord track. Then I turn off the second one, so we can set up the first filter. The first filter is set to the high pass setting and will only be used to take the low frequencies out during the intro. So first I set the highest point in the automation, which will be around 1.7 kHz. Then I select the area on my automation lane and drag the line down to about 500 Hz. Now I double click this automation point to delete it and create a falling line. Now I'll take this last automation point and drop it all the way down. Now during the first part of the intro, the chords will be very light and thin and then become warm and full during the second part of the intro. So I'll show you the difference it makes. This is without the high pass filter automation. And this is with the automation on it. It sounds a lot better. For the second filter, I set this to a low pass setting. This filter will be used during the part of the intro where the vocals kick in. It will drop down and then back up again to give it some more movement. So I click the cutoff frequency and then select the area which I want to automate on the automation lane. Then click the red automation line and drag it down. Now I delete this point again to create a falling line. Now, normally you would delete this last point, but I'll drag it further to the right to finish my automation. Okay, so next I'm going to send this track to my return track B, which has a delay device loaded onto it that we created earlier in this series of videos. This really makes the sound a lot more interesting when it plays on its own. Okay, so now I come very close to finishing this sound, but there is one more thing I would like to do. For this, I'll need my good old friend Camelphat again, so I drag it from my VST plugins browser to my signal chain. First I set it to a clear preset with nothing turned on, and then I activate the distortion tab. I'm not going to put on heavy distortion this time, but only a slight bit of tube saturation to bring the low end up a bit. Then some exciter to give it some more crispy high frequencies, and finally some Mac just because I like it. Be sure to drop the master volume of Camelphat, since the Mac distortion brings up your volume a lot. Let's also activate the compressor and let's raise the amount knob to bring in some more compression. This brings the reverb up even more, so you might want to go back in Albino and lower the reverb if it's too high in the mix and starts to drown your sound. Now, just to show you what it does, you can actually activate the flanger tab and turn up the amount knob. Sometimes a flanger can really do wonders on synths and basses, so it's always worth it to check it out. But for this sound I'll keep away from the flanger though, so let's turn it off. So one thing left to do, I drag an instance of EQ8 onto my chord track. Since we used the compression and distortion options in Camelphat, we might have brought some of the sub-frequencies back in, which we removed earlier. So I'm going to give it a high pass around 250 Hz. It should now sound something like this. Just some more small cuts and boost here and there can really bring out a sound in your mix. I'm boosting a little bit of the high frequencies and removing tiny bits of the mids. Now the chords punch through the mix even better. And that brings us to the end of this week's Tutorial Tuesday. If you like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, or like my Facebook page, or leave a comment at my website. See you next week.